Hello, everyone. My name is Caridwin Morrison. I'm 32 years old, and until the night everything collapsed, most people believed I was the safest person in the room. I was lying unconscious in an ICU bed when my father looked at the doctors and said very calmly, "Let her die." Not shouted, not whispered, said the way someone talks about canceling a meeting. I didn't hear it then. But I would later hear every word, recorded, undeniable, and I would understand that my life had been weighed against money, measured, and found inconvenient. The man who raised me didn't just abandon me in that hospital room. He made a choice that would cost him $15 million, his power, and everything he thought was untouchable. What he didn't know, standing there in his tailored suit while machines breathed for me, was that the moment he said those words, he had already lost. He just hadn't felt it yet. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you, stay with me. And if stories about truth, evidence, and consequences matter to you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them. The ICU was quiet in that way hospitals are at night, too quiet, like the building itself was holding its breath. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A heart monitor kept time beside my bed, its steady rhythm the only proof that I was still there. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. But I was alive. 4 hours after my accident, my father arrived. Richard Morrison didn't rush. He didn't stumble into the room with panic in his eyes or relief on his face. He walked in the way he walked into board meetings, measured, controlled, already calculating the outcome. His suit was immaculate. His phone never left his hand. The neurologist explained my condition. Severe head trauma, yes, but also strong neurological responses. With aggressive treatment, there was a high chance of recovery. My father didn't ask if I was in pain. He didn't ask if I could hear him. He didn't even ask how long it might take. Instead, he asked about probabilities, about costs, about what would happen if treatment stopped. The doctor hesitated, confused. "Mr. Morrison, your daughter is stable." "There's no indication." That was when my father interrupted. "Quality of life matters," he said. "She wouldn't want to live like this." He said it as if he knew, as if he had ever asked me. When the doctor pushed back, when she explained again that my condition did not justify withdrawal of care, my father's patience thinned. He glanced at the paperwork, at the insurance details, at the clock. And then he said it. "Let her die." Those 3 words hung in the air, heavier than the machines, heavier than the silence that followed. Somewhere behind him, a lawyer shifted his weight. A nurse stiffened. The doctor's expression changed, not into anger, but something colder. Recognition. Because in that moment, it was clear this wasn't about mercy. It was about money. What my father didn't know was that someone else was in the room, not standing by my bed, not speaking, not interfering, just watching, listening, and recording. I would learn later that while my father was deciding whether my life was worth the inconvenience, my lawyer, Daniel Harper, was documenting everything. He had the legal authority to be there. He had the right to hear every word. And because of a document I'd signed years earlier, quietly, deliberately, he had the right to record it all. At the time, I didn't know any of this. I didn't know my father was already discussing do not resuscitate orders. I didn't know he was asking which signatures were required or whether delays would complicate other matters. I didn't know he was thinking about the trust. 3 months before the accident, I had been sitting across from him in his office, watching him slide paperwork toward me like it was nothing. Another signature, another routine approval. I had refused. I remember the exact look he gave me then. Not anger, not disappointment, but something sharper. The look of a man realizing his daughter wasn't as controllable as he'd assumed. "You're too soft for this business," he'd said. "Your mother was the same way." My mother had built the fortune. She had created the trust. And she had locked it away carefully, knowing exactly who might try to take it if she didn't. $15 million. Untouchable. Unless I died. Or unless I became medically incapacitated. Back in the ICU, my father stood at the foot of my bed, already treating that clause like an opportunity instead of a safeguard. He spoke about foundations, about the greater good, about how money could do more work if it wasn't wasted on false hope. He didn't touch my hand. He didn't say my name. When he finally left the room, it wasn't with guilt or hesitation. It was with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the system would bend for him the way it always had. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't see yet, was that this wasn't just a medical decision. It was the first crack. The moment the truth began to surface, and the moment I started to understand that the man who taught me loyalty had none left to give. That realization would come later. Much later. For now, all that existed was the steady beep of a monitor, the cold glow of hospital lights, and a single question that would haunt everything that followed. Why was my father so eager to let me die? 3 months before the accident, my father still believed he controlled every room he walked into, including the ones inside our family. Richard Morrison didn't just run a healthcare company, he was the company. Morrison Health Systems stretched across the Pacific Northwest like a private kingdom. Hospitals, clinics, research partnerships, foundations with polished names and carefully staged charity galas. To the outside world, he was admired, respected, the kind of man people lowered their voices around. Inside our family, he was something else entirely. I worked as the company's legal director, a position people assumed I'd been handed out of loyalty or legacy. They were wrong. I stayed because someone had to understand the fine print, and because for years I'd watched the line between medicine and money blur under my father's leadership. I saw contracts routed through shell entities. I saw charitable funds redirected into temporary holding accounts that never quite led back to patients, and I refused to sign off on it. That refusal changed everything. Family dinners stopped being dinners, they became interrogations. My father would sit at the head of the table, swirling a glass of wine, asking questions that sounded harmless but were designed to corner me. Why won't you support the business? Do you understand how many people depend on us? Where did I go wrong with you? My older brother Lucas usually sat beside him, silent, careful, loyal in the way that comes from fear rather than belief. Lucas was the company's CFO, a title my father wore him into like armor. He handled the numbers, the projections, the justifications. He drank too much, slept too little, and needed our father's approval the way some people need oxygen. I used to think Lucas and I were allies. We'd grown up surviving the same house, the same expectations. But adulthood had separated us. He chose proximity to power. I chose distance from corruption. My father noticed. "You're not a team player," he told me one afternoon in his office, sliding a document across the desk. Another donation approval. Another signature meant to legitimize money that wasn't going where it claimed to be going. "I can't sign this," I said. "These transfers don't match the Foundation's charter." That was the day he stopped pretending to respect me. "Your mother built the money," he said coldly. "I built the empire. Don't confuse sentiment with competence." My mother. Eleanor Morrison had been everything my father wasn't. She built her fortune carefully, ethically, and with a deep distrust of unchecked power. When she died of cancer, too young, too quickly, she left behind more than money. She left instructions. The Eleanor Morrison Trust was valued at $15 million, locked away with surgical precision. The terms were simple on the surface and devastating in the details. The funds would pass to me in full when I turned 35. Until then, they were protected from creditors, protected from manipulation, protected from my father, unless I died, or unless I became medically incapacitated. I didn't think about that clause often. At the time, it felt theoretical, a safeguard written by a woman who understood exactly how desperate people become when they think something belongs to them. My father thought the trust was wasted on me. He never said it directly, but it showed in the way he dismissed my opinions, the way he spoke about real vision and long-term legacy. To him, money wasn't protection, it was leverage. Lucas knew about the trust. He also knew about his own financial problems. Mortgages stretched too thin, investments that never paid off, a lifestyle that depended on bonuses my father controlled. When he looked at me, there was something behind his eyes that wasn't resentment exactly. It was calculation. The tension between us became impossible to ignore. At work, my father undercut me in meetings, making jokes about nepotism while relying on my legal assessments behind closed doors. At home, he questioned my loyalty. Lucas avoided my gaze entirely. I stayed anyway. I stayed because I believed that integrity mattered. Because I believed that systems only change when someone refuses to look away. And because somewhere deep down, I still believed that blood meant something. That belief would cost me. The night of the accident, none of this felt connected yet. It felt like separate threads: corporate pressure, family distance, unspoken resentment. I didn't know that those threads were already being pulled together into something tighter, something deliberate. I didn't know that my father had already begun to see me not as a daughter, but as a variable, a risk, a number on a balance sheet with conditions attached. And I certainly didn't know that the clause my mother had written to protect me, the one about medical incapacity, had stopped being theoretical in his mind. Because when money is involved and power is threatened, some people don't wait for fate. They look for opportunity. And 3 months later, lying in an ICU bed with machines breathing for me, I would learn exactly how dangerous that kind of thinking can be. The accident didn't feel dramatic when it began. There was no music, no warning, just rain, slick pavement, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after too many late nights and unresolved fights. It was just past 8 in the evening when I merged onto the highway, my windshield streaked with water, my thoughts still tangled in unfinished conversations and documents I hadn't signed. I remember thinking, briefly, that I should call Lucas, that maybe I should try, one more time, to reach across whatever had grown between us. I never made the call. The headlights appeared first, too close, too fast. A truck drifting across lanes, brakes screaming against wet asphalt. I had enough time to understand what was happening, and not nearly enough time to stop it. The impact folded metal like paper. I don't remember the sound. People always ask about the sound. What I remember is weightlessness, an instant where gravity seemed to let go, followed by nothing at all. When awareness returned, it came in fragments. Pressure. Cold. A distant beeping that didn't belong to the world I knew. I tried to move and couldn't. Tried to speak and felt a tube where my voice should have been. I was alive, but I wasn't conscious in the way people imagine. Later, I would learn the details, that my car spun across 2 lanes, that it flipped once, maybe twice, that first responders found me unconscious with a severe head injury and a Glasgow coma scale score that made their movements urgent and precise, that I was airlifted to Harborview Medical Center, the flagship hospital in my father's own system. The irony didn't go unnoticed. The ICU was bright when they brought me in, all white light and controlled motion. Doctors moved quickly, efficiently. A neurologist assessed my responses. Nurses adjusted machines. Someone said the words strong indicators, and someone else said aggressive treatment. Those words mattered. They meant there was hope. I didn't know any of that yet. What I didn't know mattered even more was that while I lay there, unmoving, unresponsive, legally silent, my paperwork was already working. 17 minutes after the hospital logged my admission, Daniel Harper received a call. Daniel had been my attorney for nearly a decade, long enough to know that I didn't sign documents casually. Years earlier, when I first began to suspect that refusing to play along with my father might carry consequences, I had put safeguards in place, quiet ones, legal ones, the kind people don't think about until they need them. One of those documents gave Daniel the authority to be present for any medical decisions if I was incapacitated. Another gave him something more specific. In emergency medical situations, with prior written consent, Daniel was permitted to record conversations related to my care. The consent was notarized, filed, boring, unremarkable, and completely unknown to my father. Daniel arrived at the hospital before most of my family even knew where I was. He introduced himself to the staff calmly, presented his documentation, and took a seat near the wall of my ICU room. He didn't interfere, didn't ask unnecessary questions. He watched monitors. He spoke softly with the neurologist. He listened. By the time the initial scans came back, the prognosis was cautiously optimistic. Severe injury, yes, but not catastrophic. My brain activity showed promise. With proper treatment, recovery was not only possible, it was likely. Daniel noted every word. The hours passed slowly, machines kept time, nurses rotated. Somewhere outside the room, phones rang and footsteps echoed down sterile hallways. Daniel waited. He knew my father would come. Richard Morrison didn't rush to the hospital when he heard about the accident. That detail would become important later. Instead of driving straight there, he made calls to lawyers, to insurance representatives, to board members who needed reassurance that the situation wouldn't disrupt operations. By the time he arrived, nearly 4 hours had passed. Daniel saw him before I did. He recognized the posture immediately, the controlled walk, the lack of hesitation. My father paused just outside the glass doors of the ICU room, scanning the scene as if it were unfamiliar territory, rather than a place filled with machines he effectively owned. Daniel adjusted the small recording device in his pocket. Inside the room, I lay motionless, wires tracing lines across my body, a ventilator breathing where I could not. The neurologist stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing charts. A nurse adjusted an IV. Then the door opened. My father stepped inside. The room seemed to change temperature when he entered, as if the air itself tightened. He didn't look at me right away. His gaze went to the monitors, the paperwork, the people in the room, and finally, briefly, at my face. Daniel remained in the corner, silent and observant, as my father took his place at the foot of my bed. This was the moment everything shifted. The moment a man stopped being a father and started being something else entirely. And I, still unconscious, was about to become the subject of a decision that would change all of our lives. My father didn't ask how long I'd been unconscious. He didn't ask whether I could hear him. He stood at the foot of my bed the way he stood at the end of conference tables, hands relaxed, posture straight, eyes already scanning for leverage. The monitors reflected softly in his glasses as if they were numbers on a screen, instead of evidence that his daughter was still alive. "Status," he said to the neurologist. Not, "How is she?" Not, "Is she in pain?" Just status. The doctor explained again what Daniel already knew. Severe traumatic brain injury. Significant risk, yes, but strong neurological responses. My brain activity was encouraging. With aggressive treatment, there was a real chance of recovery. "How real?" my father asked. The question landed wrong. It wasn't curiosity, it was calibration. "Approximately 70%, the doctor said carefully. "And without aggressive treatment?" The doctor hesitated. "Mr. Morrison, I'm not sure I understand." My father exhaled slowly, the way he did when he believed someone was being inefficient. "If we limit care, comfort measures only, what does that look like?" Daniel pressed the record button fully on. The room shifted. Nurses exchanged glances. The neurologist straightened, her voice sharpening with professional restraint. "Your daughter is not a candidate for withdrawal of care. She is stable. There is no medical justification." "Doctor," my father interrupted. "I've run hospitals for 25 years. I understand how these things progress." He stepped closer to the bed, close enough that he could have touched my hand if he'd wanted to. He didn't. "She wouldn't want to live as a vegetable," he said. "She told me that." That was a lie. I had never said that, not once. If anything, I'd said the opposite, that life, even damaged life, still mattered. That medicine was about fighting, not calculating. The doctor shook her head. Your daughter is not in a vegetative state. Not yet, my father replied. The words settled into the room like dust. Not cruel, not emotional, just inevitable. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling through insurance summaries, deductibles, projected costs. Numbers moved behind his eyes. Experimental treatments, he said. They're expensive. They're covered, the doctor said. She has excellent coverage. That's not the point. He turned slightly, angling his body toward the lawyer who had arrived with him. Papers were already being prepared. Forms, signatures, contingencies. What about a DNR? My father asked casually, as if the thought had just occurred to him. If her condition worsens. The neurologist stiffened. There is no indication for a do not resuscitate order. I'm her father, he said. I have medical authority. Daniel spoke for the first time. You don't, he said calmly. The silence that followed was immediate and total. My father turned, irritation flashing across his face as if he'd just noticed an unexpected variable. And you are? Daniel Harper, he replied evenly. Caridwen's legal counsel and designated medical advocate. He held up the documentation. Filed, notarized, on record. My father's jaw tightened. For a moment, something dangerous flickered in his eyes, not rage, but calculation under pressure. Well, he said, forcing a smile, then you'll understand that these are difficult decisions. I understand, Daniel replied. That's why I'm here. The discussion continued. 23 minutes of my father circling the same arguments: quality of life, responsibility, the greater good. He spoke about the Morrison Medical Foundation, about how money could be redirected to patients who truly needed it, about how prolonging uncertainty could destabilize important initiatives. He spoke about my life like it was an inconvenience. At no point did he ask if I was in pain. At no point did he ask what I might want. When the neurologist refused to sign anything, my father didn't argue. He simply nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he already knew. That's fine, he said. Another physician will. And then my brother arrived. Lucas stood in the doorway, his face pale, eyes darting between the bed, the paperwork, and our father. He looked like a man walking into a storm he'd known was coming, but hoped would miss him. What's happening? He asked quietly. We're making decisions, my father said. Hard ones. Lucas moved to my side. He touched my hand. Briefly, awkwardly. The first human contact I'd had since arriving. His voice lowered. The nurses said she's responding. Nurses aren't doctors, my father snapped, and doctors don't understand business. Lucas hesitated. I could feel it even then, the pause where loyalty wrestled with fear, where conscience bent under weight. She did say once, Lucas said slowly, not looking at anyone, that she wouldn't want to be kept alive artificially. Another lie. My father seized it immediately. There, he said, even her brother agrees. Daniel's pen didn't stop moving. The DNR paperwork appeared on the tray like a final offer. My father signed first. His signature was steady, confident, practiced. Then he slid the document toward Lucas. Witness, he said. Lucas stared at the page. For a second, just one, it looked like he might refuse. Like he might remember childhood promises, shared rooms, the sister who had lent him money without asking why. Then he picked up the pen and signed. The sound of it was small, just ink on paper. But it was the loudest thing in the room. The doctor turned away. A nurse wiped her eyes. Daniel captured every second. The DNR was complete, and with it, the first line was crossed. I woke up to fluorescent light and the steady mechanical rhythm of a heart monitor. At first I thought I was dreaming, caught somewhere between sleep and memory. But then I felt the weight of my body, the dryness in my throat, the ache behind my eyes. I tried to move and couldn't. Panic rose fast and sharp until a voice cut through it. "Caradwin, don't try to speak." A woman leaned into my field of vision, her face lined with exhaustion and relief. Dr. Helen Carter. She was smiling, but her eyes were wet. "You're in the ICU," she said gently. "You've been in a coma. Just squeeze my hand if you understand me." I squeezed. The room exploded into quiet urgency. Nurses moving, machines adjusting. Someone calling my name again and again as if anchoring me to the moment. I drifted in and out for hours after that, pulled under by medication, lifted back by voices and touch. When I was finally awake enough to stay present, the tubes were gone, my voice reduced to a whisper that barely sounded like my own. That was when Daniel came in and closed the door. He didn't smile. He didn't soften his expression. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down like a man preparing to deliver a verdict. "There's something you need to hear," he said quietly, "and I want you to be fully conscious when you hear it." He placed his phone on the bedside table and pressed play. At first there was static. The faint hum of hospital equipment, voices in the background. I frowned, confused, until I recognized one of them. My father's. The sound of it hit me harder than the accident ever had. Calm, familiar, controlled. 70%, the neurologist was saying. "And without aggressive treatment?" my father asked. I felt my chest tighten. The recording continued, minute after minute, my father's voice circling the same points: quality of life, responsibility, cost. I listened to him speak about me in the third person, about my brain as if it were a malfunctioning asset, about money as if it were a moral argument. Then the neurologist said, clearly, firmly, "There is no medical justification for withdrawing care." There was a pause, and then my father spoke again. "Let her die." The words landed inside my skull like a gunshot. Daniel didn't stop the recording. "Let her die." I heard it again, sharper this time, stripped of any possible misunderstanding. Not a metaphor, not a fear, a decision. My hands started to shake, my vision blurred, not from tears but from something colder, something hollow opening in my chest. The recording moved on, papers rustling, legal language, a discussion about a DNR order. I heard my father say my name once, not with affection but like a reference point, a clause. Then I heard Lucas. "She wouldn't want to be kept alive artificially." I turned my face into the pillow, a sound tearing out of me that I didn't recognize as my own. Daniel reached for the phone, pausing the audio. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, his voice shook. "I wanted you to be prepared." Prepared. Prepared to hear my father sentence me to death like it was a budget adjustment. Prepared to hear my brother lie to make it easier on himself. Prepared to understand that the DNR, the paper I now knew existed, had already been signed. "They thought you wouldn't wake up," Daniel continued. "They believed the clause in your mother's trust would activate if you were declared medically incapacitated." $15 million. I closed my eyes, and the sentence replayed in my head again and again, each time stripping something else away. "Let her die, let her die, let her die." It wasn't shouted. That was the worst part. It wasn't said in anger or desperation. It was said the way people speak when they've already decided you're expendable. "3 independent neurologists have reviewed your case," Daniel said. "All of them agree. There was never justification for that order. Your recovery trajectory was strong from the beginning. So it hadn't been medicine. It had been timing." I stared at the ceiling, breathing carefully, slowly, feeling something settle into place inside me. Not rage, not yet. Something steadier, colder. "When he comes back," I said, my voice barely audible, "what does he think?" Daniel understood immediately. "That you're confused. That you have significant cognitive impairment." I turned my head and looked at him. "Can we make that believable?" A long pause, then a nod. "Yes." Dr. Carter returned later that afternoon, reading my expression the moment she saw it. I told her what I planned to do. Not everything, just enough. She listened without interrupting, then closed the door behind her and leaned against it. "He signed your death warrant," she said quietly. "If you want to protect yourself, I'll support you." So when my father came back into the room that evening, I gave him exactly what he expected. I looked at him with unfocused eyes, hesitated before speaking. "Dad?" I said slowly, uncertain. Are you my dad?" The relief on his face was immediate, total. He stepped closer, reaching for my hand, as if he hadn't just ordered my life to be cut short. "Yes, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'm here." Behind him, Dr. Carter's jaw tightened. Behind my eyes, the words echoed one last time. "Let her die." And I realized something important. He thought I was weak, which meant he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The next 8 days passed quietly, too quietly. From the outside, I was exactly what my father wanted me to be. A fragile patient with a foggy mind, a daughter reduced to something manageable. I asked the same questions more than once. I lost track of time on purpose. I let my words drift and slur just enough to seem real. Inside, I counted everything. Day 1, my father filed for emergency financial guardianship. Daniel showed me the paperwork after visiting hours, when the hallway outside my room finally went dark. The petition described me as a tragedy. Brilliant legal mind, promising future, now compromised, unable to manage complex assets, in need of protection. Protection was a word my father liked to use when he meant control. The request moved quickly, too quickly, judges who golfed with him, doctors who owed him favors, opinions written after conversations that lasted less than 15 minutes. Daniel documented all of it. "Let it go through," I whispered. He studied my face. "You're sure?" "If he thinks he's winning," I said, "he'll stop looking for traps." Day 2, my father brought the papers to my bedside. He spoke slowly, kindly, explaining things to me the way you explain things to a child. "This just lets me help you," he said, "until you're better." I stared at the pages, pretending the words blurred together. "I don't understand," I murmured. Behind him, a nurse's eyes flicked to Daniel. He made a note. That night, Daniel sent me copies of emails my father had already forwarded to board members, details about my medical condition, my supposed cognitive deficits, reassurances that the situation was contained. Each message was a violation. HIPAA didn't care who your father was. Day 3, I failed a cognitive evaluation. Not completely, just enough. I couldn't remember the date, but I knew my name. I struggled with abstract reasoning, but I recognized faces. I let the evaluator believe my mind worked in fragments. Dr. Alan Brooks signed off on it without hesitation. He barely looked at me. Daniel added his name to the file. Day 4, the financial movement began. The trust paperwork was prepared in advance, dates suspiciously neat. Funds scheduled to transfer from the Eleanor Morrison Trust into a temporary operational account at Morrison Health Systems, an account I'd flagged years earlier as a holding space for money that disappeared. My father didn't wait for final approval. He assumed it. Day 5, Daniel worked 18 hours straight. He moved quietly, efficiently, collecting sworn statements from nurses who'd been told to support the family narrative. He secured independent neurological reviews that confirmed what the first scans had already shown. My recovery had never justified withdrawal of care. Each report said the same thing in different language. The DNR had been medically indefensible. Day 6, the financial picture sharpened. Daniel uncovered unusual trades linked to the upcoming merger my father was preparing to announce. Stock bought through intermediaries, accounts tied to the foundation. A pattern of urgency that suggested someone needed capital fast. $15 million fast. Day 7, my father grew relaxed. He sat at my bedside and talked about the future as if it belonged to him again. About expansion, about legacy, about how proud my mother would be of what he was building. I nodded at the right moments, smiled when he smiled. I let him believe I was gone. Behind the scenes, Daniel reached out to 3 independent board members, people who had questioned my father's tactics quietly for years, but had never seen proof. He didn't accuse. He invited. Come to the meeting, he told them. Listen. They agreed. Day 8 arrived with a sense of compression, like the air before a storm. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for the morning. The shareholders' meeting, my father's public victory lap, was set for the following afternoon. Everything he'd been working toward was stacked neatly on a single calendar square. My father visited that evening confident enough to drink champagne at my bedside. Tomorrow, he said, smiling, everything stabilizes. I tilted my head, pretending confusion. Another meeting? The biggest one, he said. After that, things will be simpler. He squeezed my hand and left. Daniel returned after midnight, his tablet glowing softly in the dark. He didn't need to speak. The evidence filled the screen: audio, affidavits, financial records, timestamps lining up like a confession written in numbers. How close are we? I asked. He met my eyes. Close enough that there's no turning back. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar rhythm of the monitor. 8 days of silence. 8 days of pretending to be less than I was. The meeting was almost here, and my father still believed the room belonged to him. The ballroom at the Four Seasons Seattle looked exactly the way my father wanted it to. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering light over rows of dark suits and carefully neutral dresses. The air carried the low murmur of money, quiet confidence, polite laughter, the sound of people who believed they were about to witness something historic. At the front of the room, a massive screen glowed with the logo of Morrison Health Systems, already paired with the branding of Pacific Care Health. The merger was presented as inevitable, a done deal waiting for applause. This wasn't just a shareholders' meeting, it was a coronation. My father arrived early, moving through the room like a man greeting his own reflection. Hands shook, compliments landed easily. People leaned in closer than necessary, hungry to be seen beside power. He wore a navy suit I'd seen him reserve for victories, his confidence polished to a near shine, and beside him I was placed carefully, front row, close enough for the cameras, far enough from the stage that no one would worry about interruptions. I wore a simple dress, my posture slightly guarded, my expression distant in exactly the way my father had coached. The devoted parent, the recovering daughter, the perfect image. Lucas sat to my left, rigid in his seat, eyes fixed straight ahead. He hadn't looked at me since we arrived. His jaw was tight, his hands clasped together as if holding himself in place. If guilt lived anywhere inside him, it didn't show on the surface. Daniel sat several rows back, indistinguishable from the other attendees. He didn't look at me either. We'd agreed not to acknowledge each other. Appearances mattered now. The room settled as the meeting was called to order. When my father stepped onto the stage, the applause came immediately. Loud, enthusiastic, the kind of applause that assumes it's deserved. He waited for it to fade, smiling, basking in the moment like a man who believed the rest of his life had already been decided. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth, practiced. Today, we take a decisive step forward. Slides shifted behind him. Revenue projections, expansion plans, promises of innovation and efficiency. Numbers climbed. Charts curved upward. Words like synergy and sustainability floated easily across the room. I watched him work the crowd. He was good at this. He always had been. Every sentence landed where it was meant to. Every pause felt intentional. The merger was framed not as a business decision, but as a moral one. Better care, broader reach, a legacy of leadership. At one point, he spoke about the Morrison Medical Foundation, highlighting its charitable impact. $40 million, he said proudly, reinvested in communities that need it most. I kept my face still. He mentioned my mother only once, a brief acknowledgement, a respectful nod to the values she instilled. Then he moved on, back to himself, back to the future he claimed as his own. The room was with him. By the 30-minute mark, the sense of inevitability had settled in. People shifted forward in their seats, pens hovered over notepads. This was the moment they would remember as the beginning of something larger. My father reached the final section of his presentation and allowed himself a pause. Before we formalize today's agreement, he said, I want to acknowledge the personal challenges my family has faced recently. The room softened instantly. My daughter, Caradwyn, is here with us today, he continued, turning slightly in my direction. Her recovery has reminded me, and all of us, that healthcare is deeply personal. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, cameras adjusted. I felt the heat of attention settle on my skin. My father smiled gently. She's made remarkable progress. I nodded faintly, just as we'd rehearsed. This was his final flourish, the human element, the proof that he could carry private hardship without letting it interfere with public success. Thank you for your support, he said. It means more than you know. The applause rose again, warm and approving. My father turned back toward the podium, reaching for the documents that would make everything official. And something inside me shifted. For 8 days, I had played the part he needed me to play. Confused, fragile, manageable. For 8 days, I had let him believe that he had stripped me down to something harmless. But sitting there, listening to him speak about values he had abandoned in an ICU room, I felt something settle into clarity. This was the room. This was the moment. This was the audience he trusted most. My heart beat steadily, calmly, not with fear but with resolve. I looked at Lucas. For the first time, he met my eyes. Whatever he saw there made his breath catch. My father lifted his hand, preparing to conclude, and I stood up. The movement cut through the room like a dropped glass. Chairs creaked, conversations stopped mid-breath. My father froze, one hand still hovering over the podium, his smile faltering just slightly as he turned toward me. Caradwyn, he said softly but urgently. You should sit down. I didn't. I took one step forward, and the entire room held its breath. The room didn't erupt immediately. That was the strangest part. 200 people, investors, executives, attorneys, sat frozen as I stood there, the silence stretching just long enough to become uncomfortable. My father stared at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. His expression wasn't anger yet. It was disbelief, the kind reserved for things that aren't supposed to happen. Caradwyn, he said again, this time sharper. You're not well. My voice carried without effort when I answered. I am. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few heads turned. Someone near the aisle lifted a phone instinctively, sensing that something unscripted had begun. I have a medical ethics concern, I said calmly, taking another step toward the stage. Before these documents are signed. My father laughed once, short and dismissive. This isn't the time. It is exactly the time. He leaned toward the microphone. Security? Before the word could land, Daniel stood up several rows back. He didn't rush. He walked down the aisle with the deliberate pace of someone who knew the room was already lost. In his hands was a leather folder, thin enough to look harmless, heavy enough to end careers. You can't record private medical conversations, my father snapped, finally finding his footing. That's illegal. Daniel stopped beside the stage. Not when the patient gave prior written consent, he said evenly. Notarized, filed, completely lawful. I reached the podium and took the microphone from my father's hand. He didn't fight me. His fingers trembled as they released it. On the night of my accident, I said, looking out over the room, I was admitted to the ICU with a severe head injury. My prognosis was guarded, but hopeful. 3 independent neurologists have since confirmed I had a strong chance of recovery with appropriate treatment. Faces shifted, pens paused. 4 hours later, I continued, my father arrived at my bedside, not to ask if I was in pain, not to ask if I could hear him, but to ask what would happen if treatment stopped. The screen behind me went dark. Then it changed. Medical documentation replaced merger projections. Dates, charts, clear language. My father stepped back, shaking his head. "This is manipulation," he said, his voice rising. "She's confused. She's been through trauma." I met his eyes. "Then let them hear you." Daniel connected his phone to the sound system, the room filled with static. Then voices, the neurologists, professional and firm, my father's, unmistakable. "Approximately 70%, she said. "And without aggressive treatment?" my father asked. A few people gasped. Someone near the front row leaned forward, eyes wide. "There is no medical justification for withdrawing care," the doctor said. The pause that followed felt endless. Then my father's voice again, clear, calm, unhesitating. "Let her die." The words echoed through the ballroom, not shouted, not distorted, perfectly preserved. A wave of sound tore through the room, shock, disbelief, outrage colliding all at once. Chairs scraped back, someone swore under their breath. The delegation from Pacific Care Health exchanged looks sharp enough to cut glass. The recording continued. Paper rustling, legal language, my father discussing quality of life. Cost. The trust. Then another voice. "She wouldn't want to be kept alive artificially." Lucas. My brother's face drained of color as his own words filled the room. He stood halfway out of his chair, then sank back down, exposed in a way no apology could undo. My father lunged for the microphone. "This is taken out of context. Play the rest," I said. The final minutes unspooled like a confession. My father instructing lawyers, referencing the Eleanor Morrison Trust, talking about timing, about stabilizing the company, about signing a DNR. By the time the recording ended, the room was unrecognizable. The Pacific Care executives were already gathering their things. One of them was on the phone, voice low and urgent. A reporter near the aisle typed furiously, no longer pretending discretion. "This merger is suspended," the lead Pacific Care representative said aloud. "Effective immediately." The words landed like a physical blow. My father turned to them, panic finally breaking through his composure. "You can't do this. This is a misunderstanding." "This is a liability," the executive replied. "And we're done." The board members began to move. One stood, then another. "I move for an emergency board review," someone said. "Under Article 7. "Seconded," another replied instantly. My father looked around, searching for allies, found none. "This is my company," he shouted. "My legacy." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "It was my mother's money," I said. "And you tried to kill me for it." Security approached. Not for me. They hesitated, uncertain for a heartbeat, then placed a hand on my father's arm. "Sir," one of them said, "we're going to need you to step away from the stage." The room buzzed as he was escorted back, his protest dissolving into noise. Lucas remained seated, staring at the floor, his silence louder than any denial. Behind me, the merger documents lay untouched on the podium. By the time the board reconvened, the outcome was inevitable. My father was removed from his position before the meeting officially ended. The announcement came quickly, cleanly, without ceremony. The screens went dark. The crown shattered. And as the room dissolved into chaos, calls, questions, consequences cascading all at once, I stood there, steady, breathing through the aftermath of a truth that could no longer be buried. The collapse was complete, and it had only just begun. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded in waves. By the end of that afternoon, my father was no longer the most powerful man in the room. He wasn't even welcome in it. The board convened an emergency session while the ballroom emptied in fragments. Investors on their phones, executives whispering, reporters already shaping headlines. By the time the sun set over Seattle, Richard Morrison had been formally removed as CEO of Morrison Health Systems for gross violations of medical ethics and fiduciary duty. The merger was dead. The stock fell hard the next morning. Partners suspended contracts. Regulatory agencies opened inquiries that had been quietly avoided for years. What had looked like an empire revealed itself as something brittle, held together by intimidation and silence. Silence was gone. Within 48 hours, state investigators subpoenaed records tied to the DNR order. HIPAA violations followed, each unauthorized disclosure of my medical condition a separate charge. Financial regulators traced unusual trades to accounts connected to the foundation my father had used as a shield. The narrative collapsed under its own weight. Lucas resigned before anyone asked him to. He didn't try to justify himself. He didn't apologize publicly. He simply disappeared from the company and eventually from my life. The last message he sent was brief and unadorned. I should have protected you. I read it once and didn't reply. Some truths don't need conversation. As for my father, the fall was quieter than the rise. Assets frozen, titles revoked, invitations stopped coming. The man who had once controlled every room found himself standing alone in legal offices, arguing for leniency he had never offered anyone else. He came to see me once, weeks later. He looked smaller, older. The suit that once signaled authority now hung like a costume without a role to play. I was under pressure, he said, as if that explained anything. I was trying to save what your mother and I built. I listened without interrupting. She would have wanted— Don't, I said gently but firmly. You don't get to speak for her. That was the moment something finally broke in him. Not dramatically, not with tears, just a quiet understanding that there would be no redemption arc, no forgiveness scene. He left without asking to be forgiven. The trust remained untouched. The Eleanor Morrison Trust, the money my father had been willing to let me die for, was still exactly where my mother had placed it. $15 million, preserved by clauses she had written with a precision born of foresight. And that was where the story could have ended. But it didn't. Because when the investigations deepened, another truth surfaced. One that reframed everything I thought I knew. While reviewing old correspondence connected to the foundation, Daniel uncovered a series of personal journals my father had kept off the books. Private, handwritten, never meant to be read. They told a story my father had spent years burying. My mother's cancer diagnosis hadn't been ignored. It had been delayed. She had wanted to start treatment immediately. He had convinced her to wait, just a few weeks, then a few months, while he finalized a hospital acquisition that would stabilize the company. By the time she began treatment, the cancer had advanced beyond what medicine could reverse. Greed hadn't just followed her death. It had preceded it. The realization didn't come with rage. It came with a heavy, settling grief, an understanding that the woman who had tried to protect me from this man had herself been undone by him. And yet, even in that knowledge, I felt my mother's presence more clearly than ever. Not as a victim, but as a planner. She had known. She had written safeguards not just for money, but for truth. She had trusted that if I ever saw the full picture, I would know what to do with it. So I did. I established the Eleanor Morrison Neurological Fund, independent of any hospital system, governed by medical ethicists and patient advocates with no financial ties to my family. $5 million went toward research for traumatic brain injury treatments. $5 million funded legal aid for families facing coerced end-of-life decisions. The remainder was structured to support patients whose insurance denied care deemed too expensive. The first grants were approved within weeks. A college student who walked again after doctors said it wasn't worth trying. A grandfather who lived to see his granddaughter's recital. Families who learned sometimes for the first time, that they were allowed to say no. I left Morrison Health Systems for good. I built my own legal practice, small, deliberate, focused on medical ethics and patient rights. I took cases others avoided. I documented everything. I refused settlements that required silence. The industry noticed. Policies changed. Review boards formed. The DNR protocols my father once treated as paperwork became subjects of mandatory oversight. His name disappeared from buildings and programs, replaced by something quieter and more appropriate: accountability. I still think about that ICU room sometimes, the sound of machines, the calmness of his voice. Let her die. Those words were meant to end me. Instead, they clarified everything. If you're listening to this and you've ever been reduced to a line item by family, by institutions, by people who claim to know what was best for you, I want you to remember this. Documentation matters. Preparation matters. And timing matters. Truth doesn't need volume. It needs the right moment. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not powerless. And if you have a story of betrayal or survival, I read every comment. Some legacies are built on control, others are built on what survives it.